Welcome, everyone. Happy Friday to each of you. We're just giving it a moment or two to allow our community to get settled into this virtual learning space as we learn with and from each other. This is always a special treat every single Friday. I am Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, and I have the honor of serving as the founder and lead principal consultant for NWC. Shout out the Nika White consulting team. My team works tirelessly every single week, and they have done so for the past 4+ years to bring this virtual production to manifestation so that we can learn in community together about all things diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, accessibility, all the things, right? And intersect those topics with leadership and business. And we're so extremely excited that you have joined us today. I would like to invite you to go to the chat. Let us know where you are joining the conversation from. It is always a treat to see the many different geographies that are represented as part of our podcast community, not only just in the United States, but even outside of the US. And so we're grateful for each of you. Many of you are joining in a capacity to be fully present. Some of you are maybe just having it play in the background while you're multitasking. I also want to acknowledge that we do go live on LinkedIn. So there's a live LinkedIn audience that could be catching this episode of Intentional Conversations. And we are just so delighted, no matter what capacity in which you are with us today. And so we're grateful. I will share with you that I am joining the conversation today, not from my hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, which is where I'm based and where NWC is headquartered. But today I am in Charlotte, North Carolina. And you may be asking yourself, well, why is that? My family was displaced by the Hurricane Helene. And so I'm bringing that to the conversation because we have and still are today without power, internet, hot water. But nonetheless, we are grateful because my family is safe, and we know that this will be soon behind us. Many other families cannot say the same. So I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge all of the catastrophic issues that many people are navigating right now during this time. My heart and prayers go out to all of those families and communities. But I do believe we will rebuild and we will be stronger together because of this. So the silver lining is definitely showing forth, and I am happy for that. I want to let you know that at NWC, we really do value disability inclusion. So we have enabled the closed caption feature for those that will gain value from having that accessible to them. If you're part of our Zoom community, then cameras are encouraged and welcome, but certainly never required. We know that people are joining in different capacities, and we're just grateful to have you here in whatever way that is comfortable for you. I also want you to be aware that this is a time for community. I want to stress that because part of the value of showing up to the live podcast is you get a chance to interact directly with each other, with myself, and with our guest co-hosts that are so generously bringing forth insights to help us grow and learn and do so in community. And so I think it's important just to stress that benefit for those of us who find it fit to be here present every Friday during this hour, actually in mind, body, and spirit as we commune together. So once again, welcome to Intentional Conversations VodCast. Today is going to be a great show, so sit back and enjoy. Let the conversation begin. And that is precisely what we're going to do at this time. If you're just tuning in, this is Intentional Conversations VodCast, where we intersect conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging with leadership and business. And we're so glad you're here. One of the things that we love to do at the top of the hour is just share information about some national observances. And so we are in the time of year where we set aside to observe National Hispanic Heritage Month. That is September 15th through October 15th. And we are in the new month of October. This is our first podcast of the month. And so I want to make sure that I continue to amplify the importance of us standing in solidarity with the Hispanic community and finding ways to be allies and to recognize and be proud of all the many contributions that community brings to us day in and day out. October also is Global Diversity Awareness Month. And if you aren't familiar with this recognition, this is a time to celebrate the richness of cultures, perspectives, and experiences around the world. It's also a call to action. We must move beyond just general awareness, and we must also condition ourselves to work toward true inclusion, where diversity is valued in all its forms and equity is prioritized in every space. And so, Global Diversity Awareness Month. I also want you to know that October is not a shortage of other types of recognitions, and it's also World Mental Health Day. That's going to be on October the 10th. And I cannot stress enough the importance of every single one of us leaning into this message and making sure that those in our communities and spaces lean into it as well, especially when I consider all that we're navigating right now. We're in fourth quarter. Many people are still thinking about how am I going to meet those end of year goals. Many people have been displaced and they're dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. There is just so much that we're holding. And so be kind to each other, be compassionate, and let's make sure that we're doing all that we can to build up our mental strength. Okay. Now, October is also National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And so my message to each of you is that if you are in a community with people, which all of us are, I guarantee you that more than half of those individuals have some type of disability, whether it's visible or invisible, and they all are deserving of opportunities to be gainfully employed. And so let's make sure we are amplifying that message wherever we can. And I believe that in doing so, we're going to see that more people are going to become aware of the great contributions that individuals, even people with disabilities, of course, can provide to our larger community. Now, we'd love to share resources to help deepen your knowledge and understanding of all things diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in addition to the podcast that we bring you each week, we also release quite often different blogs and articles. And the latest one is entitled Racial Trauma in the Workplace, Manifestations and Support Strategies. And so my team is actually going to link into the chat where you can find this article to read up on it. But again, this is just one of the many ways in which we like to show up for our community with awareness and education. And speaking of education, there is a new LinkedIn Learning course that has been released only maybe a month or so ago. It's called Addressing Hate Speech in the Workplace. And yours truly is the facilitator of this particular LinkedIn Learning course, and super excited because I think the timeliness of this course is so important. There are a lot of organizations right now trying to navigate how do we effectively upskill our employees around civil discourse, being able to have tough conversations and navigate all of the complexity that we are showing up to the workplace with right now. So just want to let you know there's a tool and resource out there for you if you are looking to help make sure that you're prepared for those conversations. Now, if you have been enjoying Intentional Conversations VodCast, but you also know that sometimes you can't be here in person to actually join us as part of our Zoom live community, but you do want to get the content, well, you can do so because we do extract the audio from our podcast and we make the content available in a podcast capacity for wherever you like to get your podcast content. And so make sure that you're spreading the word. This helps us to extend our audience and our reach, and we are so glad to be able to do that. Now, we are booking co-hosts for Q1 of 2025. We're all booked up this year, but we are starting to book now for 2025. And we usually are booked a few months in advance. And so if you know of some individuals that you think would make a great co-host for us to bring to share with our community, we want to hear from you. Specifically, my colleague Amora Carter wants to hear from you. And so she does all the vetting and the booking of our podcast host. And we love to get recommendations from our community. And so make sure that you email her at amora@nicolite.com. And she will be delighted to hear from you and your recommendations. Now, one of the things that we love to do at NWC before we actually provide a formal introduction of our guest co-host is we like to give you a little bit of what you can look forward to by way of guest co-hosts coming up during that month. And so now that we are in the month of October, I want you to know who you can look forward to. So on October the 11th, Carolina Barca is going to be joining us. And in that Intentional Conversations podcast, we're going to be discussing her buy startup. It's called Fit Biomix, and how the company is more than just making innovative products that promote gut health. They're also pushing for systemic change. And so I really look forward to hearing more about this. Actually, now that I lean into this, they have sent me some products that I need to sample. I'm going to make sure that I do that before next week so that I can come to the conversation being able to kind of give you an update on what my experience has been. But yes, look forward to having Carolina here next Friday. And then on the 18th of the month, we have Sima Limberman, my friend. We connected many years ago, and we both were a part of a conference. And in that Intentional Conversations, we are going to discuss her podcast, which is called Everyday Conversations on Race. We're also going to talk about cross-race conversations, what both the DEI issues sometimes can get wrong. And so we're not always right. Some things can be done that's not as effective as it needs to be. So she's going to help us pinpoint what some of those items are. So be sure to join us on the 18th of the month. And then on the 25th, we have Rochelle Yunan Montgomery. And in that Intentional Conversations podcast, we're going to discuss belonging and overcoming conflict avoidance and healing from burnout and what she refers to as the reset framework. And so, yeah, if this is not already on your radar, make sure that you join us on the 25th, where we'll hear from Rochelle. And I know that's going to be a great conversation. Now, this brings me to the moment in our show where I get the honor of formally introducing today's guest co-host. And if you've been with us for quite some time, you know that I think it's critically important for our audience to know the accolades, the credentials, the experiences in which our guest co-hosts show up to the conversation. Just helps us to get a bit deeper into their perspective before they start sharing with us. And so I'm going to read the formal bio of today's guest co-host, Christina Blacken. And Christina is a public speaker, a performer, and founder of The New Quo, a leadership development and behavior change training company. As an expert in story as a tool for behavior change, she helps leaders create story rituals and habits to better communicate change and navigate differences. She's trained 14,000 leaders across 9 industries, including using her unique The New Quo change model, which uses neuroscience, witty principles, and narrative intelligence to help people overcome bias, deepen trust in their relationships, and achieve equitable status quo breaking goals. She's been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, Business Insider, and NASDAQ.com, among many other outlets. As a Utah native and resident of NYC for the past 14 years, she knows far more uses for Jell-O than she'd like to admit. And we're going to dig into that as well as much more momentarily. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to bring into the spotlight Christina so that she can be a part of today's conversations. And I just want to first and foremost thank you for being here. We appreciate your willingness to share with our community. And one of the things that we do here that's tradition is, Christina, we ask our guest co-hosts that before they greet the audience in whatever way that feels appropriate to them, to share something with us that we would not know about you from reading and hearing your bio, which we've just done, or from looking at your LinkedIn profile. So welcome. We're so glad you're here. I'll turn it over to you to share with our audience.
Well, I'm so incredibly excited to be here, and thank you for that lovely intro. One thing people probably wouldn't know immediately from my bio or, stalking my LinkedIn is I'm a singer, and I've been singing probably since I was 3 years old. I'm dating myself, but those old kind of like mic recording systems I used to have for kids. I'd walk around the house with that, singing that to the family. So I love music. I think it's one of the most powerful tools for connection and understanding one another, and I incorporate a lot of that into the work that I do.
I love that. And speaking of powerful tools for connection, I tell you, I've been looking forward to this conversation, Christina, because you and I share this passion for really leveraging the power of story and personal narratives. That is also something that I'm closely connected with. And what I'm finding is that it's a topic that many people are gravitating to right now because it feels safe in some regards. It feels palatable because we all have stories, right? And so I cannot wait to dig further into how that shows up into your work and some of the outcomes that you're seeing. But before we get there, I just want to talk about the New Quo, which of course you founded. And I know that, as I mentioned in the bio, that it focuses on leadership development and behavioral change. So can you share the moment or experience that inspired you to create this company and its model? And then any other information that could help us to have a better appreciation and understanding of what the New Quo is all about.
Absolutely. How much time you got? We can get into it. Well, it really starts back to my childhood. honestly, because growing up in Utah, I called myself an extreme minority, racially, religiously, and politically. I was on the outside of these dominant cultures, and I was immediately confronted with the story-making process of discrimination. So people were learning stereotypes and judgments and inaccurate stories about people that they didn't know or understand, and they were learning that from religious institutions, educational institutions, media, entertainment, and then acting upon those inaccurate stories. And so I would witness that firsthand in school and the stores I was frequenting. And then, when I left Utah and went into my professional career, I ran into that same process across the four industries that I worked in. Before I was an entrepreneur, I worked in the law world and the nonprofit and media and marketing. And every time I would enter these organizations and enter positions of leadership, I was confronted with inaccurate stories. So there would be assumptions about my capability. There would be these false narratives about me being an aggressive person for having an opinion. I could tell one quick story where in the nonprofit world I was working in, I had a colleague who was known for having tantrums in meetings, just
Mm.
yelling, being really irate, being kind of out of control. And it was just excuses, oh, that's how he is, and he's a good colleague. And then I would be in meetings and give a measured, kind, constructive opinion, and I was given feedback that I was aggressive. So that process
Mm.
of inaccurate stories and then how it shaped how we interacted with each other was fascinating for me. And so I started to dig into the research, like what is the science behind why narrative so deeply impacts belief and behavior and then our relationship dynamics. And I discovered that there was deep science behind how personal, cultural, historical story shapes how we perceive one another, how we treat one another, how we set goals. And so I started kind of teaching that and building frameworks for my own well-being. I'm like, I can't live like this. I need people to understand and perceive me in a more accurate way and vice versa. And then the new quo was really formed starting in 2018 when I started to teach those frameworks at conferences and events, and then eventually developed a training company that I went full time into in 2019. And so I was doing workshops and facilitation and teaching really simple things and tools, tactical things that people can use right away in their interpersonal communication to achieve a couple of key things, which is reducing the automatic kind of habit making we have around inaccurate stories and negative story making we can attach to change and difference, getting really clear on what their values are, and then creating shared narratives around that so they can achieve equitable goals. And it's just grown, over the last 5 years. I think this year has been one of the hardest I've ever had in business because there's been an inaccurate story attached to what DEI is and what it's trying to achieve. And so, yeah, just reminding people that a lot of the work that we need to do in equity work is really our relationship dynamics. We're not taught how to have healthy relationships at all, let alone how to have those relationships with people who are different from us. So if I can provide any insights or tools that people can use right away that can improve that, then I feel like I've done my part.
This is really good. So I show up to these conversations every week, also looking to learn from our guest co-hosts, and I often share that with our community because sometimes we do get off script, if there is such thing as a script, because we really want to be fluid and just in the moment as we take the conversation where there's a lot of energy. And I can just tell you, Christina, I have so much energy around this topic because, as I just mentioned, I think that the power of storytelling is a way to build bridges of inclusion, of belonging, is to help build and be a vehicle for connection and empathy and meaningful change. But what I'm hearing you say, which has not necessarily found its way into how I like to show up to amplifying storytelling and its benefits, is that there's equal importance that should be placed on the inaccurate stories that are often being told that can be harmful. And I think that is critically important. And so thank you for that insight. And I look forward to kind of digging deeper and learning more. I want to go to a follow-up question related to the new quo model that you have founded. And it integrates neuroscience, equity principles, and narrative intelligence. So can you break down those elements and specifically share with us how do they work together to drive behavioral change?
Absolutely. So, a quick explanation of the model is it's really to be used for people who are confronting a moment of change or difference and slowing down their thinking, their communication, and their goal setting in that process. So, it goes from awareness to attunement and action. And ultimately, those three elements that I've used to design the model are based on a couple of key factors of how bias and behavior work. So, the neuroscience behind it is really about how our nervous system is a big part of how we produce thought, emotion, and behavior. And typically, your body is always looking for rewards or threats. So, anytime you're
Yeah,
confronted with
yeah.
change or difference, an automatic sort of habit our bodies have is what I call negative narrative making. So, you see the change as what's wrong with that? How can I see if this is a threat? Is this thing safe? And it's such an automatic pattern. Many times we don't recognize it. And so being able to slow that process down and move from criticism to curiosity when we're confronted with change and difference is a big part of that model. And that really, informs us in the neuroscience of some of these things are automatic and unconscious and are driven by hormones and emotions. And then the narrative intelligence side of it is once you slow down and become curious versus critical of a change
Yeah.
or a difference, then you have to communicate effectively so that people can really understand you and connect on your values and not just on your fears and your threats and what you're afraid of. So that narrative intelligence is understanding how story is the most powerful model for getting people to understand what you care about, what goal you want to achieve, and ultimately what you might share. And then the equity principles is really how do we kind of couch all of this in really correcting power imbalances. So when we're thinking about the inaccurate stories that might pop up with a change and reducing those, then getting clear on our values and creating a shared narrative with the person, and then making sure that the goals that we're talking about and building a narrative around really serve as many people as possible and account for power imbalances that can occur because of identity and inequality and past policy. And so all those things happen in this model because we are not taught how to interpersonally interact, especially when we're under times of transition and stress. So I'll give you an example of this in action. So I did a really large project with Nextdoor, which is a really large social media platform. Some of you
Yeah.
might be familiar with it. They help neighbors to connect with one another online and in forums and share information. And they've been under, a lot of heat for having people profiling their neighbors, having a lot of bias and discrimination on the platform. And they were
Oh.
struggling with how do we get people to one, have civil conversation, reduce conflict, and really see each other and empathize. And they put out an
Mhm.
ask on their moderation and training. So I was like, hey, I have this model. I can teach this to your moderators, which the first line of moderation for them is volunteers in the neighborhoods. And then they have trained internal moderators who then also look at the content. And so in
Yeah.
this training that I designed, it was really teaching people how do you become aware of your self stories that you're attaching to people in this moment and reducing and changing the ones that might be inaccurate about your neighbors. How are you attuning to other people's cultural and historical stories so that you can better understand their identity and the unique challenges they're facing? And then how can you take action so it's a safe environment? And so people
Mhm.
were being tasked with learning about their inner stories that they believed about power and leadership and their capability as a leader in their neighborhoods and their moderation practices. And they were also being attuned to things like redlining in their city and how that's affected the dynamics of that town. And then given really practical tools for how to identify macroaggressions in conversation and reduce
Yeah.
those. And we saw within a 6-month period of people taking this training, there was a significant reduction in microaggressions, as well as people feeling like they had leadership power, regardless of title or status, to make a difference in the conversations in those neighborhoods. We had around 43,000 people sign up to do the training, and about a third finished it. And what was
Wow.
fascinating to me, because Stanford was looking at this material, there's a research organization called Spark at Stanford who looked at the data. They were seeing that people were also giving feedback about using these tools with their families. So people were
Mhm.
like, as a moderator, I just learned some things about how I can slow down and expand the narratives I believe and see, and then make specific practical action in my communications. And I could use this with my family. I could use this with my partner.
Yeah.
I could use this with my friend. This is not just about moderating content in the neighborhood and with people who might be strangers. And so that to me was really affirming that that feels so complex and abstract and negative, when we break it down into the interpersonal communication, our conversations, our emails, our presentations, and we slow down that process of negative narrative making and switch it to curiosity and also switch it to our values, we can have significant changes, significant changes. And that feels so much more accessible and aspirational than a punitive approach to what DEI can be.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think a restorative approach is always the best way versus a punitive approach. People don't want to feel attacked. And so, if we really are trying to change behavior and cultivate relationships, we're going to have to think about it from a restorative perspective. And I love, Christina, how you brought to the conversation, curiosity versus critical. And you're right. I think that when we become much more curious than critical, that's when we open ourselves up to being able to hear and receive stories and believe stories. Because sometimes part of the challenge is when people share their stories or their personal narratives, especially those from marginalized communities, often they feel that they aren't believed. And I think this is such a fascinating topic. I am curious what you're seeing as it relates to bringing this storytelling culture and approach into corporate spaces. The example that you just gave, it certainly highlighted how just in between families and even just like community members, neighbors, how that can build up the interpersonal communications and skills. But I am of the firm belief that I think that a storytelling culture that is implemented very meaningfully and intentionally. And the upskilling is there to help individuals within organizations to see effective storytelling as a power skill. I call soft skills power skills, that it can have significant business outcomes. And I just wanted to bring that to the conversation and give you a chance to kind of respond. I mean, do you agree? Are you already seeing some of that? Share your thoughts.
Absolutely. I can give a couple of really interesting examples. So a lot of the work that I do is learning and development and education. So going into groups and upskilling their communication and their understanding around what equity is, how leadership is a practice and mindset and not just title, and how storytelling is their most powerful tool for trust
Yeah.
building, for moving towards goals. We're
Yes.
doing this all the time unconsciously. I think 65% of all daily communication is story, but we don't think
Yes.
about it intentionally when it comes to how we're talking about values and goals. Because the only real, I guess, task that a leader has is creating powerful narratives around goals and motivating people
Yes.
towards a different end. So one of the trainings I do is around inclusive leadership and culture, and I've worked with organizations across so many different industries. And one of the things I notice is this concept and belief around leadership, where I tell people leadership is a practice. It is not just about title, status, or appearance. And I've noticed in these trainings that people will have a light bulb go off and think, oh, I actually have leadership skill and a leadership story. I just need to get clear on what my values are and how am I taking key elements of my personal and professional story to communicate those values effectively and connect on those with people that I'm collaborating with so I can better see them and understand them. So, for example, I was working with a really large cybersecurity company that has an international team, and they were struggling with growth. You know, anytime there's an explosion of growth in an organization, culture suffers because people are like, these are all new people, new processes. I'm not sure where we connect on. And one of the things I tasked them to do is to share their leadership stories. So their early experiences of leadership in their hometowns, from the leaders around them, the demographics of those people, the beliefs and behaviors of those people, and how it shaped their own beliefs about leadership. And also hearing the leadership stories of their colleagues. And it was powerful and fascinating because everyone learned something deep and meaningful about the people in the room that was beyond stereotype, beyond assumption, and they found universalities that they didn't know they had in terms of
Yes.
understanding, like, I've never seen certain leaders that look a specific way. Or I always thought leadership was really about task and domination and control and delegation. And I was confronted with this new style of leadership that was empathetic and compassion first. And so seeing that shift and them finding meaningful connection beyond transaction is very powerful because most people in organizations are really interacting transactionally. There's a thing I need from
Yeah.
you. Here's a deadline of when it is. They know
Yeah.
nothing meaningful beyond the surface. And you don't have to be best friends with all the people you're working with, but having a more accurate and full story of somebody's past experiences, their beliefs, especially around the interactions and things they've had about power and leadership, can be so meaningful for building empathy and genuine trust. So that's a huge one that I've seen often in group dynamics where they're like, I don't really, I'm here. I don't really understand what I might have in common with these individuals. And then by the end, they have a shared narrative around a new definition of power and how they're using that and how they set goals and move towards their values. And then the other thing, I've done some individual leadership coaching for people who are really struggling in their
Mhm.
leadership communication. And I had one individual who actually was brought to because she was getting some pretty negative feedback about her leadership style. She was called insensitive. She was being told that she was perpetuating microaggressions. And this is somebody who was living in South America, but her team was in Canada and the US. And so they had
Okay.
different regional understandings. And so she was really confused because she's like, here's what I've learned about leadership. You have to be strong and unflinching. You need to be direct so people take you seriously. You need to be assertive. And I'm like, all those things are great. But
Mhm.
also, there needs to be nuance and understanding and empathy of the unique challenges your team is facing and communicating those in a way that they can hear you. And so I helped her to expand the cultural and historical narrative she understood about her teams in the region. I helped her to find a new sort of narrative around her own leadership and what it means to be confident without being punitive and without being transactional and authoritative. And she was like, wow, I'm really feeling completely differently with how I'm connecting with the team and getting feedback. So I think really the process is always how are we expanding the sets of stories we believe about power and how it works and our cultural experiences of it, how is it showing up in our day-to-day conversations and how we listen, how we ask questions, how we set goals, and are we really genuinely listening to other people's stories effectively so we can really understand them beyond assumption and stereotype? Because if you're just operating from the automatic stories you've attached to people, you probably are wrong. I mean, there's already people, for example, on this Zoom or this LinkedIn Live who may attach stories to me right away just based on appearance, on my vocal cadence, whatever it might be. And some of those stories might be accurate and some of them might be very wrong. And so
Right.
I think slowing down that process, whether it's in a group setting and dynamic or one-on-one with your own leadership style, is so incredibly important and powerful and overlooked often because a lot of DEI, which is important, is structural and it's policy and how are we recruiting. But at the end of the day, if your culture and your communication practices and behaviors aren't up to snuff, it doesn't matter what kind of recruitment processes you have and how diverse your staff might be. If that culture is toxic and unsafe and full of stereotype and inaccurate stories, people will not want to stay and they're not going to collaborate effectively.
Yeah. That is a mouthful of richness and so much goodness was packed in there. I want to just take a moment to kind of reflect and to respond to some of what resonated with me, which all of it did, but I'll just pick out a couple of things. The first thing is you mentioned that a lot of workplaces, the relationships can become very transactional, and I could not agree more. In fact, one of the things I've been highlighting in a lot of my talks about the power of storytelling is that when we think about human resources, we place way too much emphasis on the resources portion and not nearly enough on the human portion. And the value of personal narratives being shared and the vulnerability that it's being displayed and modeled by leaders who are willing to allow themselves to be vulnerable is that we are building connections because it humanizes experiences. It helps people to get proximate to others' lived experiences, which I think can drive that empathy that you've been talking about and help break down some of those stereotypes. The other thing too is I think that there is a lot of value in helping leaders to recognize the power of their vulnerability, because when leaders are vulnerable and they're sharing their stories, right, then they're giving others permission to share stories as well. And I think that is a part of helping to bring others along on this broad concept of power of storytelling and sharing those narratives, and even helping to demonstrate that vulnerability is not weakening our leadership, ability or potential. It's actually strengthening it, and I think that's important. There's a reason that when we tuck our kids in at night, for those of us who have kids, and my kids are grown and old, but they're adults now. But when I used to tuck my kids in, I didn't tell them a bedtime, facts, a report of a whole bunch of facts. We told them bedtime stories because we were looking for those opportunities to deepen the connection. And so anyway, this is such a fascinating topic to me, and I'm so glad that we're having it today.
Yeah, just thinking about what you said about vulnerability. So one of the things, so I have a LinkedIn learning course called Leadership Storytelling that's available.
Mhm.
And one of the things I talk about often is how leaders can demonstrate story as a tool for relationship building and connection. And it comes
Yeah.
down to how they tell stories around these key four change moments that happen pretty often, which are origin
Yeah.
moments. So it's the first time something is occurring. Your
Mhm.
adversity moments, which happens all the damn time. We got plenty of adversity in the world and the planet. So there's all types of stories around that.
Yes.
And then your success stories around goals that you've set and achieved, and innovation stories when you've done something original or unexpected or divergent, right? And so I think leaders, one, being able to identify those moments often within the organization and the workplace, and then telling effective stories allows people to know what your values are and to connect on those values. And it
Yes.
also teaches other people to have that identification of values. Because going back to the neuroscience, your brain is trained to look for threats and rewards. So you're constantly creating stories and attaching those to threat experiences, which, if you think about most conversation, it's usually a complaint or judgment. People are constantly complaining or leaning into negativity bias because it feels safe and it feels like we're reducing threats. So even in the organization, if you have a culture, for example, that's constantly just only focused on risk management and the threats and the bad and what we have to do or else, it creates this environment where our values and the only things that we connect on is distrust and not being safe. But if you
Yeah.
model, like, here are our four key values, we care about creativity, community, enlightenment, and then you're recognizing those moments within origin experiences, adversity experiences, innovations experiences, and telling powerful stories around those events, it helps people to reorient themselves. It builds that muscle to look for rewards in the environment versus just threats, and then allows them to have a shared narrative around where things are going. Because at the end of the day, if people aren't bought into some kind of shared goal that is mutually beneficial to everyone, they're probably moving
Yes.
through fear and moving
Yes.
threats because of the neuroscience of how our bodies operate. I think people forget that our brains and our bodies are still kind of stuck in an evolutionary period that is well before the technological advances we have now. And so we're constantly trying to catch our bodies up and not always feel like we're under constant threat or uncertainty and find ways to connect beyond those things because we're not going to be able to innovate or collaborate if we're
Right.
only recognizing threats in the environment, criticisms in the environment, and telling stories about that. Because how do you create when all we're talking about is what's bad and what's wrong?
Right.
I think a lot of people are
Exactly.
afraid of DEI because they think it's only about talking about what's wrong and bad. And I'm like, what we really need to do is envision what would it look like for an organization to genuinely lean into goals that are genuinely an expression of values, not just
Yeah.
about survival, not just about, growth for growth's sake, not just about profit by any means necessary, but actual shared values. And if people are empowered to express those things and be seen as leaders, even if they aren't the CEO, I think that completely shifts the culture of an organization. And most organizations operate on a threat-based fear-driven model of how they communicate, how they set goals, how they delegate tasks, which leads to a lot of the power imbalances and inequalities being repeated essentially.
Absolutely. So well stated. And a lot of what you just shared, it brings to mind the importance of change management. The whole point of being intentional around change management is because in order to get people to embrace the change, to buy into the change, to allow their mindsets and behaviors to flow with the change that needs to occur, we have to first persuade people why they should care, why they should engage and see it as something that is positive. And so I appreciate the connectivity also to change management. I think that it can be very difficult for organizations to shift culture without a change management strategy, and sometimes that is an absence of doing DEI work, where I think it needs to be very much instrumental, especially when it comes to driving equitable outcomes. So, how do you help leaders and organizations make sustainable change in the area of thinking more intently about the change management process?
Yeah, one of the things is recognizing what are the positives of this change. So in the change model that I
Yeah.
teach is how does the change actually express your value? So for example, maybe you're going through an acquisition and there's going to be significant change in staff and leadership and also resources. There's two ways to frame it. You can frame it as this is going to be a challenging time. We're going to have all hands on deck. Everyone must do X, Y, and Z, or we're not going to hit certain quarter goals. Or it could be reframed as this change is allowing us to have the resources we need to create at the level that we know we can and to innovate in the ways that we've been wanting to in the last year. And when you reframe that story around why is the change occurring? How is the change beneficial to the individuals affected by it? And how does it express your shared values? You're far more likely to have success and buy-in. I've lived through so many
Absolutely.
acquisitions in my career, for example, and I've seen leaders handle them very differently. Some have been like, hey, we're desperate, we are fear driven, and we just need to make it work and weather the storm. And others are like, hey, this change is actually going to help us to deliver on our mission and our original
Yeah.
goals of the impacts we're trying to create. Here's why this change is meaningful. Here's why it matters. Here's why it's beneficial to you. And when it's been communicated that way, I've seen people weather all types of things and they probably should have quit, where they're like, I believe in this mission enough to weather this challenging time and know that it's temporary. So one of the things I ask leaders to do is to get very clear on their leadership story. What is the transformation that you're trying to move your people through? And what stories demonstrate that effectively? You have to
Yeah.
be clear on the transformation you are leading as an individual. And what are your personal and cultural stories that model that demonstration in real time, give people examples, give them hope, give them a vision for the future. If you're not doing that as a leader, they're going to insert their own narratives, right? People will make up their
Right.
own stories about why change
Right.
is occurring because again, we are narrative making, meaning making creatures who are always
Yeah.
looking for rewards and threats. And so if they're
Yep.
like, oh, I have an automatic habit of seeing most change as a threat, they're going to attach a story that feels the most accurate to them and their lived experience, which could be wrong. So you don't want your colleagues to fill in the changes with these inaccurate stories. You want to be proactive and model those changes and create that transformational story for them. I think also
Right.
pulling from lived experience is important. I know a lot of leaders are like, I don't want to tell my personal business and let it all hang out. And I think that's fair and fine. I don't think we need to have trauma dumping or vulnerability
Yeah,
hangover. So I think it is important to have what I call a story bank. So you're essentially looking at those origin, adversity, success, and innovation moments from your personal and professional life and maybe out in the world. And then you're categorizing them so you have them to pull from your bank, right? So for example, when I talk about my company, I pull from my childhood stories and tell specific ones, but I don't let it all hang out every discrimination or adversity that I face because
right.
the racism or the religious prosecution or whatever I was experiencing as a child. I can still demonstrate that value without having to let it all hang out. So,
Of
story bank is
course.
incredibly important as a leader, and knowing when to effectively plug those stories in when you are communicating one on one, when you are setting meetings, when you are talking about goals, when you are doing presentations. And that takes some practice, but the more that you practice it, the more it becomes a really strong habit. So I would say that's the primary thing. The other thing is to ask better questions. So a lot of
Yeah.
the time, people don't know much about the people they're trying to lead and mentor and manage because they don't know anything about their personal stories and they don't ask what I call questions of curiosity. So it's open-ended conversations so you can gather more information and stories from your colleagues. One that I've always recommended people do in their one-on-ones with individuals is asking people about, what are the things that you're excited to try and to learn? And you get to
Mm.
learn stories about their personal passions, what are things that they want to achieve and experience, and then align them to the appropriate opportunities because of it. And when you have regular story sharing and collection in your meetings and the places where you're supposed to be developing and mentoring others, you're far more likely to also accurately know their values so you can tell the right stories to motivate them towards these new goals when a change is occurring. So a lot of this sounds very intuitive and it's not that complicated, but a lot of people are not doing it. They're not doing it
Yeah,
well.
you're
And
not. You're
again, they
right.
tend to default into that negative, fear-driven story making that we have a default for that leads to a lot of distrust and a lot of fear anytime change is occurring and anytime difference is occurring.
Yeah. So once again, that block of commentary is leaving me with so much to think about, and I want to just kind of comment on a couple things that are coming up for me. The one is I love the idea of a story bank, and I do think that to your point made earlier, a lot of us we naturally gravitate towards sharing personal narratives and stories, right? But imagine if we were to be exposed to the information that we're talking about today in terms of doing it more effectively and really truly appreciating the depth of the power and the benefit of it. I think that that would create greater sense of urgency and intentionality about it. And then that in and of itself, I think can carry us a long way forward in terms of really being able to embed this type of philosophy into just our everyday interactions and personal interpersonal communication. When you talked about the change management process, two words kept coming up for me. One was transparency. I think that people are willing to follow along if they feel like a level of honesty is being presented around, and with the communication around what the changes are, the transformation that needs to occur. And then the second word that was coming up for me was clarity. We know that clarity is kind. We know that resistance is often a lack of clarity. And so, if you really want to be effective around your change management, make sure that you are being transparent and honest, and also make sure that you are providing clarity. And sometimes that clarity means stepping out of the role of all that you know and really testing, the communication with others that are new to the conversation, just so that you can understand where those gaps are as you're leading into that communication. And the last thing that I'll comment on would be how the sometimes it can be difficult for people to share their stories, because one question could be, am I oversharing now, right? What is the difference between really leaning into the moment and being vulnerable versus now I am oversharing and I am exposing so much about myself that may not be necessary or could be even harmful, maybe to myself or to others. And one of the things that I often encourage people to do is to pause and think about the why and the purpose behind the story.
Yep.
And I think that connects back, Christina, to what you were saying about a story bank. If you have an intentional story bank that you could tap, right, then you have already kind of counted the cost and evaluated what is the purpose and the value of this story. And sometimes the purpose and the value is not necessarily for us, it could also be for others. Maybe I'm sharing my story because I'm healed from it, so I don't need the healing, but I'm sharing my story because I know that someone else in my midst is maybe dealing with a similar thing, but they don't have the agency to kind of show up and articulate what they're feeling and experiencing. But if I do so, then maybe that gives them also permission to try to own whatever that is and then be given the support that they need. So much goodness comes
Yeah.
out of storytelling. And I just
Yeah. I
wanted
have
to
a comment
highlight
about that.
that with, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of great alignment. So this today is a gift. I believe it's a gift for me and our community because yes, I love everything that you are saying, Christina.
Yeah,
So
you
I
bring
want
up a
to
really great point I wanted to highlight quickly around.
please.
So in the model I talk about, the emotional outcomes I'm really focused on is self-awareness, empathy, and influence. And this awareness step of the model is really about your self-awareness of your own internal stories, your experiences when it came to those origin, adversity, success, and innovation moments, and the lesson in those. So you're really evaluating them for, is this a story to be told publicly? You're going to ask the right kinds of questions to evaluate that story, to see what the lessons, the wisdom, the impact might be, and even, is this going to push forward equitable principles and ideas, or could this unconsciously and unknowingly push forward something that might not achieve that result? Because some stories may be, distorted or maybe missing pieces. So I think that self-awareness portion for leaders, really evaluating their inner self stories, their lived experiences, and their values, and getting clear on those is incredibly important. And then the empathy portion is understanding other stories so that you know which ones to connect on. Because if you know about people's lived experiences and values, you know which ones to pull from your story bank that can relate to it or affirm it. And so I completely agree. I think this story process, when it's intentional and it's conscious and it's thoughtful, is one of the most powerful ways to build trust. And for me, DEI really at the end of the day is building trust and sharing resources so everybody benefits. And we live in a very distrusting society. Actually, Edelman just released their trust barometer. They've been running it for 20 years. And they look,
Mhm.
I think, at 20,000 people across, I think it's
Yeah.
50 countries, don't quote me, look it up. But they essentially have come out with some really interesting measures of how people have lost so much trust in almost every institution, and
Mhm.
how they're looking for their peers at this point to tell them the right sorts of stories to essentially move them forward. And we've seen some of the damage of that when people tell myths and inaccurate stereotypes, which we're seeing all over the place, even in the political sphere that we're dealing with. It can lead to measurable negative outcomes. And so it's really powerful and important for people to recognize their strength as an individual, and telling the right kind of story as a leader will really move people forward in ways that we are desperately needing right now in such a deeply distrusting world, and in so many problems in our institutions as well.
No, I totally agree. So we're at that moment in time where I want to give the audience just a heads up that we're going to be shifting to take your questions and comments. If you're part of our live Zoom community and you have a question or a comment, then you can use the raise hand feature that lets me know that I can, if your camera is on, add you to the spotlight and invite you to unmute yourself to share directly. Or if you just really want to continue to listen in, but you do have some curiosities that are bubbling up, place those into the chat and I will try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have remaining. And if you're on LinkedIn Live, we have not forgotten about you. We appreciate you being here. You can go to the comment section to add your questions or comments, and then we will bring that over here into the discussion so that we can be all connected. So while you're maybe percolating on thoughts and questions that could be circulating, I'm going to give you a moment or two to do that by going to the next question, and then I will come back to see if we have any takers on that. What I want to ask you about, Christina, is for those who are sitting back and they're hearing this conversation, they're feeling really empowered, thinking that, yes, I haven't thought about personal narratives or stories in quite the way that's being presented today, but they're feeling a lot of trepidation and reluctance and wanting to share their stories for all the reasons that we've named already. But what are some maybe top 2 or 3 tips that you will give those individuals for overcoming challenges to storytelling?
The first one I would give is doing a story audit. So that's really evaluating what are the stories that you're regularly consuming. Because what you
Mhm.
consume influences how you feel and also influences how you might tell stories or what you focus on. So do an audit of the podcasts you're listening to, the books that you're reading, the TV shows you're watching, all of those things have an impact on the narratives internally that you might be operating from, making decisions from, connecting with other people from. And the more that you can expand the stories that you're, exposed to, the more comfortable you can become in telling different kind of nuanced stories and working on the spot when you're thinking about how to connect with someone. It just makes you a better storyteller. It makes you more conscious and empathetic. It also makes you more creative. So that process is something you can do constantly, even if it's once a week or once a month, you do that audit and you add one new type of story to consume. I think that can be really, really powerful. And it's something that people don't do very consciously. And it can have a huge impact on your ability to feel comfortable. To one, when you're listening and consuming stories all the time, it just makes you a better storyteller. But also being
Mm,
exposed to new ideas and experiences, story is the one thing, there's just a concept that's been found by researchers called narrative transport. When you are put into the literal lived experiences of others and you can feel them physically, psychologically, and
yeah.
emotionally as if you experienced it firsthand. So if you
Mm,
want to deepen your empathy and know about something that maybe you've never experienced, you need to just listen to the story. And it can have huge impacts on your brain, how you feel, your emotions, your hormones, all of that. That's the big first one. Then I would say the second one is practicing. You can practice
yeah.
right now if you get clear, do some values exercises in the trainings and courses that I offer. I help people to get clear on what their values are and pull them from their lived experiences and life stories, and then creating a structure of storytelling around their values. So if you have
Yeah.
those key values, are you identifying them on a day-to-day basis and telling stories about them? So, for example, I have a value of liberation and people being free to express themselves. And I was
Mm,
riding in the park the other day. I live across the street from Prospect Park, and there was this incredible guy who was listening to this really fun, like dance music on the side of the trail and was like dancing really fun. And people were kind of stopping and having a good time with him. And I remember recognizing that. I'm like, this is a fun story for a story bank to showcase what does self-expression that's unfettered look like. And so if you can get better at recognizing what I call the rewards portion of neuroscience, recognizing your values in your lived environment, attaching stories to them and telling those to your friends and family, it can make you a better storyteller. And it also helps you to be values oriented instead of threats and fear
yes.
oriented. Because if you're not conscious of that, you likely are just going to tell stories about what's wrong, what I'm stressed about, what I'm anxious about. And not that those stories are bad. I think it's important to express those as well. But if it's 90% of the time you're doing that automatically and unconsciously, and 10% you're expressing values, you probably are not telling the stories that you want to really showcase who you are as a leader, what you care about when it comes to changing and setting goals. So, practicing your values and the stories that you attach to them in real time and doing your story audit, expanding the sets of stories that you're exposed to, especially around different identities and experiences and cultures, will make you a better communicator, a better thinker, and you can build better relationships because of it.
Yeah, those are really phenomenal tips. I'm not seeing any hands raised right now or questions into the chat, but there's a lot of commentary in the chat. So I do recommend that if you haven't taken a look at the chat to our community here to do so. I want to add on to some of those tips for overcoming challenges to storytelling. I think that also upskilling ourselves around navigating difficult conversations in general could be really useful as well, because part of inclusive storytelling is that we aren't shying away, right, from the tough topics, the stories about exclusion or discrimination or inequities. Not to say that all the stories need to certainly fall into those categories, but we do have to be willing to go there where there is necessity to do so in order to spur meaningful change. I think the other thing too is really leaning into this notion of authenticity, and again, it goes back to when we were talking about vulnerability. And authenticity in storytelling does not look like glossing over struggles or challenges, right? That can lead to just these surface level outcomes, without really addressing these systemic issues. And I think that that's important, especially in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and trying to shift and change systemic issues that have plagued our many marginalized communities for so long. And so balancing those stories, I think, is critically important. And to that point, Christina, how important, from your point of view, do you think psychological safety and fostering psychological safety in different environments is for creating safe spaces for storytelling?
It's incredibly important. I think the ways that people react to other people's stories sets that tone. So if someone's
Yeah.
telling you about a lived experience or a personal experience that you don't fully understand, there are small things you can do to deepen the connection and trust, and there are other things you can do to completely derail it. I think
Yeah.
one is just affirming what you heard from people. A lot of the time when I do story sharing in my trainings, where I have people share personal narratives around specific prompts, like that leadership story example I shared earlier, I have them
Mhm.
say what resonated with them about the stories they heard, what might be similar to the
Yeah.
personal experiences they had, and to avoid judgment and to
Yeah.
avoid advice giving unless it's asked for. Because often we're trained to immediately try to solve problems and offer
Fix
advice
it.
if we think that's the way to relate and to affirm somebody. But
Yeah.
often it can be just, it can feel dismissive to the person who just wants to be heard and affirmed. And we live in a society that doesn't affirm people often. We're usually telling people what they're not good enough in some way, whether it's how
Yeah.
they look, they dress, they speak, the money they have, whatever it might be. People are constantly grappling with really challenging, limiting stories about their worth. And so if you can create a space where you literally genuinely listen without interruption and with
Yes.
affirmation, you're going to create a safer space. I think the other part of it too is allowing people to give you feedback without defensiveness. Because again,
Mhm.
we live in a culture that does not teach us how to fight or have conflict in a productive way. We live in a very violent
Right.
culture, physically, psychologically, emotionally. And so if you're a leader who can take in criticism and not immediately jump to defense, hear the story that they're saying, even if it wasn't your intent, the impact matters. So it's important to have space for feedback, for discomforting feelings, for finding resolution, for taking atonement and accountability, and to not jump to automatic stories of defense, right? A lot of us are taught
Right.
whatever narratives you picked up from your lived experience and your families from how you deal with conflict will perpetuate into your relationships within the workplace and in your personal life. So I think that's
Mhm.
incredibly important. Are you slowing down, moving from criticism to curiosity? Like I mentioned, when someone gives you feedback and finding resolution and a shared sort of narrative about the moment, you're more likely to build that psychological safety. So those things are something you can do. People struggle to do this in their personal life with the people they trust the most and they have the
Right.
most similarity with, let alone with people who are pretty different. And so if you can practice those skills of slowing down the stories you're attaching to somebody and why they might be doing what they're doing, and ask questions and get curious and try to find resolution, accountability, apology, change behavior, you're going to create that psychological safety that people are desperate for. We are in a time right now where people want change, they want difference, and they're also scared to speak up and to say what they need
Right.
because there are repercussions for it. And there's,
Yeah.
people who experience being treated in a different way because they're being honest about what's not working. So you can create those environments, you'll be well ahead of the curve on how most people are leading and communicating with their teams and the people that they say they care about.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And people want to be able to share those stories in a safe environment where they aren't being judged and without the fear of retribution. So I'm glad that we were able to touch on psych safety and how important that is to building a culture of storytelling. Um, I want to we're closing in on our time, but I do want to have you just to address your thoughts on how the storytelling phenomenon can really impact and how it could be leveraged within leadership decision making process.
I would say the biggest thing is to figure out what are our values around these goals and what stories can I tell that demonstrate those. And as a
Mhm.
leader, if you do that clearly, you're more likely to get people to be influenced and inspired to create a change. And so it's necessary to do that reflection. I think most people do not know what their values genuinely are in practice and in action. So if you say you value creativity, what does that look like? And can you give me three examples or three stories that showcase that? Right. So
Yes.
like I think that's the important part. People are saying values in a performative surface level way because it feels good and it sounds nice, but then they're not really demonstrating or practicing it in real time. And the more you can be values driven versus fear driven, you're far more likely to be influential. And anyone can practice that regardless if they're in the C-suite or if they're a manager. Everyone is constantly trying to influence people towards specific goals and outcomes
Right.
and their pitches and their conversations and their Slack chats. And so the more that you're like, what are my values and how am I expressing that in stories so people really get it and understand it? And are we connecting on those values and finding what our shared values are? I think that's the most powerful thing most leaders should be doing. And, we're getting there. We're getting more people to understand that leadership is about mentorship, it's about emotional regulation, it's about value setting and achieving goals that are hopefully beneficial to everyone and not just delegation and control and domination. And I think that
Absolutely.
domination and control model, the very antiquated traditional conventional model of leadership, is failing us spectacularly across
Agreed.
every facet of society. And we're seeing people who are falling out of favor of this idea of being highly narcissistic and self-indulgent and exploitive in your quest of power and using that as the main tool of how you move towards goals. And so I think people are ready. They're excited and ready about a more self-aware, empathetic, and influential model of communicating. And we're desperately needing it in the many challenges that we're facing as a society. And I think if you practice that on a small scale in your immediate environment, it'll have a ripple effect, almost like a domino, of us creating a
Yes.
new paradigm.
Yeah, very well stated. I wholeheartedly agree that as well. I think that storytelling to inform decision making is really powerful and important, especially when we can leverage that feedback to shape more inclusive policies and initiatives, within the environment. And then when we think about often how organizations will conduct these deep dive assessments and use that data in order to inform decisions. I think that what comes up for me in the context of the storytelling conversation is that the qualitative data is so equally, if not more so important oftentimes. And sometimes we'll skip that and only just gravitate towards quantitative data. But that qualitative data, those are your stories in many ways. Those are your personal narratives of people experiences. And that counts when you're really trying to make some decisions that impact a body of individuals. And so I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank you for being here with us today. I want to thank our community for coming and sharing. We have shared a lot of information and ways in which people can connect with you, Christina, into the chat. So I hope that you all are paying attention to that. I want to give you the final moments to close us out in whatever way that feels comfortable. If there's something that's top of mind for you that you did not get a chance to socialize, I would love to give you that opportunity at this time.
Absolutely. The one thing I would recommend everyone do is to slow down the stories that you assume about others. So often
Mm,
operating from stereotype and assumption and criticism. And so now if you can ask the question of, is the story that I'm attaching to this person in this moment, is it inaccurate? Is it the full picture? And if I don't have enough information, am I asking the right questions to really understand who they are, what their intentions were? And if you can do that, you are going to create changes you didn't know was possible. So please slow down the assumptions, the stereotypes, the criticisms, the judgments that you attach to others of all types, of all backgrounds, and to yourself as well. And I also think, I'm in a time now where I'm so excited to connect with like-minded people. So if you're interested in any of this work, please reach out to me. I have a LinkedIn learning course that's a starter for how to use some of these tools immediately in your communication. And just know that we're in a time of experimentation and learning. And I think that's exciting. I think it's exciting when things are falling apart, which we're living in a fall apart time right now, right? We're falling apart.
all a
It
part
is
time right
time that
now.
we can rebuild and have innovation, and
It's
we are in a cycle of regeneration. This is the natural cycles of life, is when something dies, something else can be reborn. And so I think people can look at this moment as a moment of regeneration and innovation and real
yes.
building for the future.
A moment of regeneration. I think that is a beautiful place to end. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Christine. I look forward to staying in touch. I look forward for many others to be able to be exposed to this wonderful, powerful message today. Thank you all. Have a great, safe, and healthy weekend. Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone.